Welcome to today's Explainer. So we're going to break down one of the most bizarre and honestly terrifying events in human history. Imagine a horror movie, right? But the monster isn't some creepy creature or a deadly virus, it's literally an unstoppable urge to dance. Today, we are diving into a thoroughly documented, absolutely true historical phenomenon known as the dancing plague. This was an epidemic where ordinary people literally danced to their deaths. Now, I know it sounds like pure fiction, but we actually have the city chronicles, the medical records, and the church documents to prove this whole thing happened. We're going to use all that historical evidence to unpack exactly what went down, how the authorities somehow managed to make things so much worse, and the fascinating scientific theories that finally explain how an entire city could just dance itself into the grave.
Okay, picture this. It's a hot, sweltering July day in 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, which back then was a really prosperous city in the Holy Roman Empire. The whole nightmare begins with just one single woman, known in the historical records as Frau Trophäa. She steps out of her house onto the narrow cobblestone street, and she just starts to dance. There's no music playing, there's no festival going on, there's absolutely no visible reason whatsoever for her to be doing this. At first, her neighbors just assume it's, a strange mood or a momentary lapse of reason. But the hours tick by and she doesn't stop. A full day passes, then another. According to the chronicles, Frau Trophäa danced continuously for 4 to 6 days straight before she finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion.
Now, you might easily write that off as a tragic, isolated mental breakdown of one person, right? But what happened next turned this weird anomaly into a living nightmare for the entire city. Within a month, this solitary dancer turned into a terrifying mob of up to 400 people. And the witnesses of the time described the scene in horrific detail. These were not joyous partygoers. The dancers had their faces contorted in just absolute agony. They had unseeing glazed-over eyes, like they were trapped in a deep trance. Their feet were covered in bloody blisters. Their clothes were torn to shreds. They were crying and screaming in pain, completely unable to control their own bodies, almost as if some invisible force was puppeteering them. And tragically, they were dying right there on the streets from exhaustion, strokes, and heart attacks.
Let's dive into the timeline here because the escalation was just staggering. It starts with just 1 hour of Frau Trophäa dancing alone. Bizarre, for sure, but seemingly manageable. But then she hits the 24-hour mark, dancing without a single moment of rest. By the end of the first week, the phenomenon proves to be incredibly contagious. 34 more people have joined her in this unstoppable violent dance. At this point, the city council could no longer ignore it. They literally had a mass casualty event unfolding right in their public squares. The sheer speed at which this blew up from one erratic citizen to 3 dozen and eventually to 400 forced the authorities to step in and desperately try to find a cure.
So what exactly did the city council do? Well, they turned to the medical experts of the time. Now keep in mind, 16th century medicine was heavily based on the theory of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The local doctors examined these hysterical, bleeding dancers and basically concluded that the citizens were suffering from an overheating of the blood. They diagnosed it as hot blood, which was essentially a physical imbalance causing a temporary madness. And if the root cause was trapped, overheated blood, the medical logic of the day dictated a very specific and kind of wild cure. The victims needed to physically exhaust themselves. They literally had to sweat and dance the disease out of their systems.
So, following that medical advice, the authorities did exactly the opposite of what you'd actually want to do in a public health emergency. The expectation was that by giving them a designated space, the victims would quickly burn out this hot blood. Get this, the city council actually built a large wooden stage right in the middle of town. They hired professional musicians, drummers and pipers, and even brought in healthy, robust dancers to keep the victims moving. They literally weaponized the environment to encourage the dancing. But the reality? Oh, it was a total disaster. The lively music and the chaotic spectacle didn't cure anyone. Instead, it acted like a massive psychological magnet, drawing even more vulnerable, stressed-out citizens into this frantic, deadly marathon. The authorities were essentially pouring gasoline on their own epidemic.
Once dozens and potentially hundreds of people had literally danced themselves into early graves, the city authorities finally woke up to their massive mistake. They realized the music was only making things so much worse. So they abruptly reversed course. They passed emergency decrees that strictly banned all music, dancing, and even gambling and other public amusements. They cleared the public squares and started loading the remaining convulsing victims onto wagons. They basically banished them out of the city, hauling them up to the mountainous shrine of St. Vitus.
Saint Vitus happened to be the patron saint of dancers, and the authorities now firmly believed that only religious intervention, prayers, and specific rites at his altar could break whatever horrific curse had befallen their people. Now, here's what's truly terrifying. Strasbourg wasn't just some isolated freak incident. This phenomenon, which historians actually call choreomania, haunted Europe for centuries. If we look back to the 1020s in Bernburg, peasants reportedly ruined a Christmas service by dancing uncontrollably around a church. But look closely at the pattern in the two largest outbreaks. In 1374, in Aachen, tens of thousands of people danced frantically, foaming at the mouth, right after massive, devastating floods of the Rhine River destroyed their crops and caused a brutal famine. And then consider our 1518 Strasbourg outbreak. It was immediately preceded by catastrophic rain, sudden frosts, complete crop failures, rampant disease, and extreme poverty. That is definitely not a coincidence, and it's absolutely the key to understanding the science of what really went down.
So, how does modern science actually explain a whole city spontaneously dancing to death? Well, experts generally point to three distinct theories. First, environmental food poisoning. Second, the incredibly powerful role of mass superstition. And third, the ultimate breaking point of the human mind, stress-induced mass psychogenic illness.
Let's start with theory number 1, ergot poisoning. Ergot is this highly toxic fungus that grows on damp stalks of rye. It contains psychoactive chemicals that are actually structurally very similar to modern-day LSD. If a medieval population ate bread made from that infected grain, they would absolutely experience intense hallucinations, severe twitching, and uncontrollable spasms. However, modern historians are pretty skeptical that this is the main culprit. And why is that? Because ergot poisoning typically causes violent, localized convulsions, or it cuts off blood circulation leading to gangrene. It is highly unlikely to cause rhythmic, coordinated dancing that lasts for days on end. Plus, several outbreaks of choreomania happened during hot, dry seasons, when the ergot fungus simply couldn't even survive on the crops. So, while it might have played a minor role, it definitely doesn't explain the whole picture.
All right, theory 2 leans heavily into the dark power of the mind and deep cultural beliefs. In medieval Europe, there was this deeply ingrained, terrifying legend about Saint Vitus, an early Christian martyr. The belief was that if you angered him, he would curse you with an unstoppable, torturous urge to dance. In fact, the dancing plague was literally referred to by the locals as Saint Vitus's dance. People believed this curse was an absolute, literal reality. Some researchers argue that this intense cultural fear acted as a psychological trigger. Think about it. If one highly stressed person on the street had a nervous breakdown and started twitching or moving erratically, the deeply superstitious crowd around them would instantly recognize it as the dreaded curse of Saint Vitus. That sheer contagious terror could psychologically infect the observers, causing them to physically manifest the exact same symptoms.
And that brings us to theory 3. This one is championed by British medical historian John Waller, and it's currently the most compelling explanation we have. This theory looks right back at those devastating natural disasters we talked about earlier. Waller points out that these people were surviving on the absolute ragged edge of human endurance. I mean, they had endured back-to-back famines, lethal disease outbreaks, freezing winters, and literal starvation. They were physically depleted and living in constant, agonizing fear of God's wrath. Waller argues that under this unbearable weight of collective trauma, the psychological dam essentially just broke. It wasn't a biological infection spreading, it was a psychological one. The town was basically suffering from a mass psychogenic illness, entirely triggered by starvation, trauma, and this overwhelming collective sense of doom.
So the whole crucial point here is summarized perfectly by this concept. Under extreme chronic stress, the human psyche can just fracture. It enters this dissociative trance state where the conscious mind entirely loses control over the physical body. And because that cultural script of the Saint Vitus curse already existed in the back of their minds, their breaking psyche defaulted to that specific manifestation, which was dancing. And remember the authorities building a stage and playing music? Well, that only amplified the bystander effect. The more people who gathered around to watch the spectacle, the more people were exposed to this intense, highly contagious display of psychological distress, which just triggered a devastating chain reaction throughout the entire city.
Now you might be asking yourself, come on, is this all just a myth or some crazy exaggeration? We obviously can't go back in a time machine and do an autopsy on someone from 500 years ago. And yes, 16th century chroniclers absolutely love to add a bit of literary flair to their writing. But the reason historians treat the dancing plague as undeniable fact is the overwhelming consensus of independent sources. I mean, the events are strictly documented in official city council records. We have the detailed medical notes from the actual physicians who treated them. We have church ledgers noting the religious interventions. But most importantly, we have a clear, repeated pattern of this exact behavior across multiple centuries and different cities, always following mass trauma. We know it happened because the evidence left behind is just too vast and too consistent to be a total fabrication.
So, the dancing plague of 1518 wasn't a demonic curse, even though it absolutely felt like one to the poor people living through it. Instead, it serves as one of the most stark, chilling testaments in human history to the sheer power of the mind. It shows us exactly how far human reason can be pushed when cornered by starvation, terror, and collective trauma. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all this, the mechanism of mass psychogenic illness hasn't actually disappeared. Modern psychiatry still documents outbreaks in closed environments like schools or factories even today, where acute stress causes groups of people to adopt sudden, uncontrollable physical symptoms. So, I'll leave you with this thought. What is the human mind truly capable of under extreme despair? And which of these theories do you think best explains the horrific events in Strasbourg? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the history and keep learning.